Well, good morning to you. If you are watching this is indeed take 2 of this video. I recorded it on Friday night and posted it for Steve to download. And unfortunately, when he did, there was no sound on it. I have no idea why that happened. And I have been at drill all day with my National Guard unit. And I'm just now getting a chance to sit down and do this at about almost 10 minutes till 7 o'clock. And so big shout out to Steve for making this happen and getting this thing uploaded as soon as he could, as soon as I could get it to him. And I really appreciate that. I owe you a steak dinner, buddy. Of course, some of you may have a different opinion on that. You may wind up writing him a nice little note and say, couldn't you have just simply lost the file or something like that? But anyway, so we today are in Luke chapter 8, picking up where we left off last time we were in Luke. We're going to be reading from about middle third of the chapter, starting around verse 26 and going through verse 29. We'll come together for some prayer. And then we'll dive into this passage, okay? So, again, Luke chapter 8, verse 26. And we are taking a look at a very familiar story that I'm sure many of you have heard preached and taught upon throughout your years if you've grown up in church or been a part of church in a Christian community of Jesus followers for quite some time. And so I'm not going to give you a fresh and interesting or new take on this that brings to light some sort of mystical meaning behind this, because this story is pretty straightforward, but we're going to take a look at a few other things that hopefully helps us understand this better. So on into Luke 8:26. Then they sailed to the region of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. When he got out on land, a demon-possessed man from the town met him. For a long time he had worn no clothes and did not stay in a house but in the tombs. And when he saw Jesus, he cried out, fell down before him, and said in a loud voice, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." In Mark's Gospel, the actual word that's used there, if we were to go back and research the Greek, literally is "ah." It's as if this demon is crying out through this man and saying, "Ah, Jesus, what do you have to do with me, Son of the Most High God?" Verse 29, for he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. Many times it had seized him, and though he was guarded, bound by chains and shackles, he would snap the restraints and be driven by the demon into deserted places. "What is your name?" Jesus asked him. "Legion," he said, because many demons have entered him. And they begged him not to banish them into the abyss. A large herd of pigs was there, feeding on the hillside. The demons begged him to permit them to enter the pigs, and he gave them permission. The demons came out of the man and entered the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and drowned. And when the men who tended them saw what had happened, they ran off, reported it in the town and in the countryside. Then people went out to see what had happened. They came to Jesus and found the man the demons had departed from, sitting at Jesus' feet, dressed in his right mind, and they were afraid. Meanwhile, the eyewitnesses reported to them how the demon-possessed man was delivered. Then all the people of the Gerasene region asked him to leave because they were gripped by fear. So getting into the boat, he returned. The man from whom the demons had departed begged him earnestly to be with him, but he sent him away and said, "Go back to your home and tell all that God has done for you." And off he went, proclaiming throughout the town how much Jesus had done for him. Would you join me for a moment of prayer? Jesus, we are so grateful that you have watched over and shepherded us through yet another week, for the experiences that we've had, and for some perhaps even that they have had to endure. And you have proven your faithfulness over and again, renewed your mercies morning by morning. You've allowed us to come together through this particular session virtually, but we're doing so for the protection of our flock. And again, we are grateful that you have kept many of us, perhaps all of us, throughout this week safe. And we are grateful that classes are coming together again, and we are looking forward to ramping up to that time when we do all get to meet together again. But until then, again, we pray for patience, wisdom, discernment, and love for our leaders as they are doing what they can and what they must in order to try to keep us safe. Lord, I pray that you will help us open our eyes, unstop our ears, remove any hardness of heart that might prevent us from seeing something perhaps that we haven't seen before as it comes to approaching this story in the gospel narratives, and understand the true intent and reason or rationale behind why this story was even included in the first place, and what we are to understand May you be glorified in all that is said. In your name we pray. Amen. So I want to discuss this story across the spectrum of the Gospels that it appears in. It's not in John's, but it is something that is shared commonly throughout the synoptics of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we would find this story housed in Matthew 8 and right at the beginning of Mark chapter 5. But if you were to turn to that material, what you'll also see is that this story is included in each of those two other gospel accounts, paired with the other story that comes before this, and that is the story of Jesus calming the troubled waters after he was aroused from sleep by his disciples, who woke him up, terrified, gripped in fear, thinking they were going to die if Jesus didn't do something to intervene. And then after this, they wind up sailing from what was the northwesterly corner of the Sea of Galilee to the eastern shore, perhaps even southeastern shore, to get to the Decapolis area, where this region of Gadara or Gerasene, depending on the gospel that you're reading, it's part of those townships that are near one another, where in Matthew's gospel it says two men who were possessed by demons, but in Mark and Luke's gospel it says just one. No contradiction there. It's just to say that perhaps it was one person that Jesus actually interfaced with as far as talking, but Matthew gives us that little extra bit of detail that it was indeed a pair of men. So imagine how much more troublesome the two of them were as a combo, terrorizing the towns around them and making it virtually impossible, or I would say extremely difficult, to try to pass around or through those areas without seeing these men just running around literally like lunatics, screaming, crying out even into the night, cutting themselves and doing all manner of violent and crazy type of things, right? But when they get there, then this story is what happens. And so we are going to discuss that story before we really dive into and start to look at this particular story. And again, I would just say, as I did before, this story is rather self-explanatory. There isn't really any deeper level of mystical meaning that we are to attach to this, even from someplace in the Old Testament, because as it comes to the ministry of Messiah and what is spoken of by the prophets, you've heard me revert to Isaiah 35 many times to discuss how Messiah would bring about healing for the lame, the blind, the mute, but there really isn't hardly any information in there at all about him setting people free from the demonic oppressiveness of those fallen spiritual entities that, as dispossessed spirits of some sort. We're not trying to dive into demonology here, but understanding a little bit about the fact that the Bible doesn't make an argument for where they came from, who or what they are. It's just the fact that there is a surge of demonic activity around the time that Jesus is ministering, and he is driving out demons everywhere he goes. And a part of that, of course, is to destroy the works of the devil, which we've touched on before in previous lessons. So we're going to discuss what's leading up to this story. And having said that, because our lesson writers really don't talk about anything surrounding this particular passage in Luke to try to situate it into the context of what's going on before it, I feel a freedom, and I hope that you'll bear with me in this, in being able to take our attention off of Luke and just simply transition over to Mark. And part of the reason why is because, number one, Mark was perhaps the first one to actually pin this story down for us. Doesn't mean his version of the story is any more accurate than the detail that the other two gospel writers would include, but my second point behind that would be it's much easier to sum up his material and what leads up to him including this for us than it is to go through 7 chapters of Matthew, 7 chapters of Luke. And if you just simply look at the way the gospel information or narrative is structured for us, in comparison to Mark, Matthew and Luke include almost the exact same information. Virtually the only differences would be that both of them include birth narratives. Luke goes a little bit more into Jesus' childhood with that story about when the time he was 12 and in the temple, and Matthew with the flight into Egypt, but that happened around the time Jesus was a toddler. And then, of course, Jesus comes back to Israel, and he is raised by his mother and stepfather in Nazareth, and then silence basically for most of that time until Jesus begins his public ministry. And that's where Mark, for the most part, picks up. And Mark's gospel is really not focusing so much on Jesus' teaching. It only hits a few points in there where he actually goes through some of Jesus' discourse, the whole Sermon on the Mount, while it's one cohesive narrative in Matthew. It's chopped up into pieces in Luke, and nothing is said of this at all in Mark. And so more of Jesus' teaching becomes the central focus with respect to Matthew and Luke. Matthew kind of painting Jesus as more of a greater fulfillment of the type that Moses began to foreshadow of Messiah, of being something of a king, definitely a prophet, and of course a priest with the role he played in sacrificing and sanctifying the temple and all those, or the tabernacle and all those good things, right? And really focusing more on Jesus' teaching. And Luke does the same thing, but of course he brings in more of a Gentilian focus in Jesus' interactions with other people, like the centurion and so forth. And so understanding that, they're creating more of a space to include these things as far as filling in those gaps, and not to say that puts things chronologically for us in Matthew and Luke. You've heard me talk ad nauseum about how the modularity concept of the gospel, so we're not going to dive back into that. But understanding Mark is taking a lot of that out and really just focusing more so on Jesus's actions. So what I'm going to do is kind of do a little bit of a chapter-by-chapter synopsis to lead into the very tail end of chapter 4, which is the story of Jesus calming the troubled sea, and then helping set the background for what's going on here with these men. And I'm really just going to refer to the singular man, so please don't be confused when I do that, because that's how two of the gospel writers refer to it. And so I'm just going to use that concept moving forward, that it's just the one person, right, who answers and says, "We are legion." But it jumps into that story of the demons being driven out by Jesus, because we need to understand, and if you want to know the reason why I'm doing this, it's because we have to answer the question, why is this story here? What is it that they want us to get? And we need to also grasp the fact that the Gospels were not written primarily for communities of Jesus followers, because they have already come to faith and believe. Now, granted, it certainly would serve a great purpose, and that was indeed part of the reason, no doubt, why the Spirit moved these evangelists to write these encounters, because as time progressed and this generation was coming to a close, those eyewitnesses were starting to die out. Paul says that in 1 Corinthians 15, when he speaks of this community of 500 people who saw Jesus after he was resurrected, but some of them had already fallen asleep. So these eyewitnesses are starting to die out, and now would be the time to pen the most historically accurate version of the encounter. And so no one could say that, these stories have been embellished upon. Those skeptics attempt to try that now that we have entered into the era of higher criticism of the last century and a half. Be that as it may, the reason why they're writing these narratives is for the sake of what John says at the end of his gospel. And I think that is a thesis statement that can reasonably be applied to the other gospels, that it's for those who read these to come to a conclusion as they're being led by the Spirit on who is this Jesus. For the Jews reading Matthew's gospel, for Gentiles reading Mark and Luke, more so Luke, I suppose. Mark may be written a bit more focused on those Christians who are suffering and experiencing persecution at the hands of the Romans, and especially Jews who are not part of the Jesus community, and are doing everything they can to create that distinction between themselves and these people who claim to worship the same God that the Jews do. And maybe that's a reason for his impartial, I'm sorry, I'm getting these words mixed up, for his very biased focus on Jesus' actions versus his teaching, and the fact that Jesus is presented in Mark's gospel as more of a suffering servant, right? But they're geared more toward helping people who read these to come to an understanding of who Jesus is and what are they to do with this. And Mark's gospel is certainly structured that way, because the way he ends that gospel with this resurrection account of Jesus and the women being frightened and running away, it's almost like he leaves it on the cliffhanger of, hey, so now that you've read through this entire gospel and you've seen who this Jesus is and how he's behaved, and this cataclysmic event that ended with not only him being crucified, but then rising from the dead, and that resurrection being attested to by eyewitnesses that saw his body gone and spoke to the angels who pronounced his resurrection. What are you going to do with that? How do you respond in faith? That's ultimately what these gospel narratives boil down to, is how do non-believers respond in faith? And of course, as we read these stories, how do they change us, and how do we respond in faith? Are we like those who are hard-hearted and fail to see the truth, or actually responding as we're supposed to be, as people who have been drawn to Jesus by the Holy Spirit and come through repentance and faith, and now being brought in to a relationship with him under terms of the new covenant? Are we acting and behaving like disciples? So I'm going to focus our attention more on Mark and talk about any perhaps distinctive differences that might be there between Matthew and Luke, but there really aren't many. So chapter 1 of Mark, what we really need to understand is that, again, as all the Gospels focus on, it's the coming of the kingdom. that Jesus is bringing the long-awaited, long-anticipated kingdom of God into human existence. And we've already mentioned many times before, Luke 19 is a great understanding of what the idea or the ideology behind what the kingdom of heaven was supposed to be on the part of the Jews who were anticipating it. And Jesus is deconstructing that, and he's rebuilding that through a new interpretive approach to the scriptures and the Old Testament that focus on what Messiah was supposed to do and how the course of his ministry was supposed to go, including his suffering before he would enter into his kingdom, and what the concept of kingdom really means, right? And that it's not something of a terrestrial focus in the sense of an actual capital city with a palace and him sitting on a throne with a crown. It's him ruling cosmically through the hearts of his believers over all humanity. And one day, of course, he will bring to fruition the culmination of the kingdom when he returns. But the kingdom has already been inaugurated. It's begun now. And Mark starts his gospel off by talking about that. He jumps right into the ministry of John the Baptist and the fact that he is the herald of the Messiah. And he's warning everybody that Messiah is right on his heels. And then when he comes, he's coming with both reward and judgment. And then Jesus is presented as Messiah to John, and John, through John, the gospel writer's additional information, we understand that he didn't realize that was Jesus until after he baptized him, and then that sign of the Spirit descending upon him in the form of a dove. And the Father pronounces from heaven that this is his beloved Son in whom he's well pleased. And, of course, we're supposed to listen to him, right? And then after this, while Mark doesn't really include any details about how Jesus was tested in the wilderness, he does include for us the fact that he was driven there by the Spirit, and he was tested. And then Matthew and Mark fill in the gaps for that. Matthew and Luke fill in the gaps for that. And then after he passes his test, he comes out of the wilderness, and now he is able to proclaim the kingdom. And what I mean by that is that if we go back to the Garden of Eden, when the first Son of God, as Luke points out in the end of Jesus' genealogy, that Adam having no earthly father, God was considered for all intents and purposes his father, and gave him that first of covenants made with humanity, that you are to multiply, fill the earth with more image bearers, and by virtue of that knowledge and the glory of God, right? Adam was tested in the garden, he failed. Jesus was tested in like fashion, and then he passed. And whereas Adam could not now fulfill the mandate of filling the world with more image bearers and thereby knowledge of God in the way he was intended to, Jesus can. And he is announcing the kingdom of God that he is bringing into human existence. And he begins the process of redeeming Israel by first choosing new leaders that are his disciples. And we understand he didn't choose all 12 at once. He's slowly handpicking them. It wouldn't be until a time later on where, after much prayer throughout the night, he then calls out these 12 that he will label as his emissaries, apostles, that would carry on this very important task of advancing the gospel and seeing the kingdom advanced with that, of course. And then as soon as he starts that, then chapter 1 ends with the kingdom's announcement or announced arrival being accompanied by signs. And we see this first by driving out demons and the touch of the supernatural, not only present in Jesus, but now crashing into human existence by virtue of the finger of God working through Jesus to literally push out the strong man from the stronghold he's built on this earth, this nest of sinfulness and brokenness that he has created, and destroying the works of Satan, right? And then after that, he cleanses a leper. And Jesus focuses on those who are just the absolute worst in the sense of their contrived essence of impurity. Because certainly a leper, there's nobody that could be further from God than a leper, because they're not even allowed to live in a village or town where people are, much less go into God's presence as far as the tabernacle before the temple and then the temple was concerned. But Jesus is bringing the holiness, righteousness, and purity of God right to them. And when they're asking, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean, kind of saying, will you? Are you willing? And Jesus saying, of course I am, and touching them and driving away that leprosy, right? And we're seeing the kingdom manifest in their hearts, and he's inviting them into this new creation to be a part of his new family and this new kingdom that God is bringing into existence. Roll into chapter 2, more focus on the kingdom, because now as Jesus continues this series of events where he's manifesting this divine power, he goes on to heal a paralytic. And this was the one let down the ceiling tiles. But before he simply tells him to take up his mat and go home, he first tells him, your sins are forgiven. And why? A lot can be said on that, but we'll just simply suffice here by saying that the understanding from a story in the Old Testament, from the book of Numbers, where Miriam is speaking vehemently against Moses, motivated by her envy and jealousy of him. God breaks forth leprosy upon her flesh. And when that happens, people obviously saw that God was bringing a curse upon her for what she was doing, and that God was dissatisfied with her act of sinful rebellion. And so looking at a story like that, it's easy then to contrive that a person who bears in their own flesh some sort of malady or calamity like this, that obviously they must have been touched by a curse from God, no matter what it was that they, or whether they know what it was that they did or not. Even if their parents a generation before, as is the kind of the working theology in John 9 with the man who was born blind, and Jesus' own disciples thinking somebody had to have sinned, either his parents or this man did, for him to be born blind, right? And Jesus is saying, in essence, not only to the Pharisees, who he's going to interact with next, and say, so that you may know that the Son of Man has the power and authority to forgive sins. Why? Because the Son of Man is equal to God, because he is God incarnated in human flesh. But looking at this man and saying, God is not angry with you, and God did not bring this malady upon you because of something that you did. And you need to know that God is not angry with you. And therefore, I'm telling you that God says your sins are forgiven. And then he comforts him even more by healing him of his sickness and then sending him on his way. So the truth is being revealed. God is not angry with those who are sick, which is hugely shocking to those who are hearing these things and wrestling with this truth and understanding, or coming to a better understanding of what does this mean if the kingdom is indeed coming. Because Jesus is talking about the kingdom everywhere he goes, telling people, repent, the kingdom of heaven is nigh, it's at hand, it's near, depending on what translation you're reading. It means it's literally pressing upon you as if it's in your very face, right? And Jesus goes on to call a tax collector, Levi, who we also call Matthew, to follow him and be a disciple. And Matthew throws a massive party, invites all these other tax collectors so that they can see and hear what Jesus has done for him. And perhaps through this experience also, some of them will be invited to join the family of God and as part of his new creation and the kingdom, right? And with that, what we also see is that a rolling band of Pharisees come by and they hear the carousing and whatnot, and they see that Jesus, who they are learning about and sense is a rabbi based off the things he's teaching and doing, and yet he's fellowshipping with people like this. This is obviously not right, and they call him or take him to task over this. And Jesus is saying, I did not come to call the righteous to repentance, because certainly everyone who is well doesn't need a physician, but they who are sick. But Jesus is also referencing them in the fact that they too are sin sick and are in need of help. But it's the fact that Jesus is here to save lives, destroying the work of the devil, saving lives, and the kingdom is meant to invite all people in, not just those who in their own mind and perceived sense of self-righteousness think that they have earned or merited a position and a place in the kingdom. And then Jesus, of course, after this is accused of his disciples not fasting. And a problem with that is they see this, of course, as being a very important ritual and a tradition passed down to them from the elders, that they do this routinely throughout the week. And Jesus is saying it doesn't make any sense to, because they should be rejoicing. The kingdom has arrived, started to make its presence known in human history, as God has foretold and ordained that now would be that time. And why would they mourn? They have the bridegroom amongst them. They have the king in their presence. There will come a time he won't be here. And when that happens, then they can fast and mourn. But while they're here, we're doing something new, and we're doing what makes sense. It doesn't make sense to take a patch from an old garment and put it into a new garment. A new garment and put it into an old garment. Nor does it make sense to take new wine and put it into old wineskins. Both of them will be ruined and tainted by that. We're doing what makes sense. And that's altogether a new thing, divorced from your traditions, which are vain, empty, and hollow. And then to end that chapter, Jesus is being accused by the Pharisees for working on the Sabbath, because he's going through a field and he rubs his hand together over some grain heads and he's eating the grain from that. Why? To sustain his body, which is in vital need of nourishment because of the fact that he's hungry. And Jesus then takes them to task again over the fact that they are valuing ritual and tradition over the actual commandment of the law, which was not to do rigorous work, not things that are necessary for human survival. And then after this, jumping on at the end of chapter 2 and into the beginning of chapter 3, Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath. And whereas Jesus pronounces himself as being Lord of the Sabbath at the end of chapter 2, he proves that at the beginning of chapter 3 through the validation of the miracle and the sign that he gives them, because if he can claim to be Lord of the Sabbath, heal on the Sabbath, and God does not strike him dead for saying such things, doing such things, there has to be solid, valid truth to this. And again, that's evidence of the fact the kingdom is arriving and is spreading, right? Then we jump on into chapter 3, and Jesus' ministry of healing starts to reach out to the masses. People start to flock to him from all over the place, down in Judea, up to Galilee, Idumea, which is the ancient remnants of the ancient kingdom of Edom, and also the regions of Tyre and Sidon, and all from Samaria and around the area of the Sea of Galilee, Decapolis. So we're talking massive influx of Gentiles who are hearing about this teacher, this healer, and they're coming to see what he's talking about, what he's doing. And with that, Jesus then chooses his new family, because he completes that cohort of the 12 disciples who he now rebrands as being his emissaries, those who will go forth and pronounce the arrival of the kingdom with his authority as him being the king. And then after this, Jesus is accused of being in league with Satan, and that he drives out demons by the help and power of the prince of demons, Beelzebub, right? And he rebuffs that teaching by saying, or sharing with him the truth that, listen, hey, a house cannot stand if it's divided against itself. In other places, a kingdom cannot stand if it's divided against itself. And certainly we would have to argue as well, it makes sense to say, and a family cannot stand if it's divided against itself. And Jesus is saying, this is the new family I'm inviting you into. Let's think about this rationally for a second. And he goes on, to really totally destroy their arguments about how in the world he could possibly be endued with power from Satan to work against what Satan has spent so many centuries building, millennia even, building through the wreckage and ruin of Adam's decision. It doesn't make any sense. And he even calls them into question the idea that their own children are also casting out demons. And if they do that, and they think that God is manifesting himself through that work as well, certainly that means if Jesus is casting out demons, then he's doing so by the finger of God, and the kingdom of God has arrived among them. And he tells them the reason why he came was to bind the strong man, who, if he knew the time that the thief would come, would have made preparations, but he didn't. And the strong man is indeed being bound, and would be ultimately through Jesus' action on the cross. And Jesus then would begin the process of spoiling his domain and taking all the possessions that belong to him and making it his own. And that's what the kingdom of heaven's purpose is, right? And Jesus is then, a remark is made to Jesus about how blessed, his mother and brothers are looking for him. And Jesus has sat down and he's got his disciples, these 12, circled around him, and perhaps more in successive ranks beyond them. And he says, these are my mothers and brothers, my mother and brothers. This is my family, those who do the will of God and have answered the call to repent and enter into the kingdom through the narrow gate, and having followed the narrow way that leads to it, right? And so then we jump on into chapter 4, and we're almost there. You've been patient. We've been at this for almost half an hour, and we're almost to that point where we'll start talking about our story of focus for this passage today. But in chapter 4, Jesus begins to reveal the secrets of the kingdom through parables, and the parable that he gives to the public is the parable of the sower. And obviously his own disciples struggle with this, so how many more are around? Not to say no one understood it, but I would venture to say the vast majority of them probably didn't. And then when they retreat and they are away from the crowds and they're in a more private, intimate setting with Jesus, they even ask what it means. And he begins the process of explaining, but he also tells them it's for you to know these things. And if you don't understand, there's a problem, but it means you need to kind of work on your listening, because you need to be careful how you listen. These secrets were withheld even to the prophets of old to be revealed to you at the time in which they would be spoken in your presence, and you would see the things, the signs that accompany them to validate and assure you that indeed the kingdom has arrived. And then he even gives them a few additional parables to talk about the kingdom. And Mark, this is probably one of the heaviestly concentrated areas that he focuses on with respect to Jesus' teaching in the whole gospel. And after we've spent all this time through Mark 1 into the beginning portion of Mark 4, focusing on the kingdom and who Jesus is, and seeing how he interacts with people and doing things that are social taboos, with touching lepers, socializing with tax collectors, placing his hands upon women and touching them to drive out demons and so forth, or even heal their calamities and speak to them, which in most cases was completely beneath a Jewish rabbi of his stature, that he's willing to interface and focus on those people and give his affection and attention to those who were social outcasts, both poor or I should say poor both economically and in social stature, as we've seen represented in many of our lessons before. But now we jump into a whole different facet of Jesus's identity. And this is what I really would like for us to grab a hold of and spend some time on, and perhaps walk away from the story with a bit of a different understanding than what we've perhaps garnered before. But we have to walk through the story of Jesus giving the command to his disciples to enter into the boat as he's sending the crowds away, and then he enters into the boat. And while they start the journey of sailing across the Sea of Galilee, Jesus probably falls asleep within minutes because he's physically exhausted from all the ministry effort he's been pouring himself into, and rising early in the morning to spend time alone with God, to pray, and spending time well into the evening teaching in the privacy of other people's homes and around campfires, and probably not getting a whole awful lot of sleep. And his body is indeed letting him know he needs that. And even to this day, these wild, crazy storms that just arise on the Sea of Galilee literally come out of nowhere with these warm pressure fronts that blow in from the east and across the desert between the Mesopotamian Valley and the Near East, or what we typically call the Levant. And then these cold pressure fronts that blow in from the Mediterranean Sea, and they both happen to meet one another right there over top of the Sea of Galilee. And whereas it was a beautiful, crystal clear morning, and there may be beautiful sunsets as the sun sets in the west, at the end of the day, a violent raging storm that lasts for an hour or so can just literally come up out of nowhere while boats are out there in the middle of the water. And that's probably where these disciples were trapped when they experienced this. And so imagine just how exhausted Jesus really was to be sleeping through this rocking boat that's just going up and down through these waves that probably have white caps on them and crashing all over the place, because terror has indeed filled the disciples, even the four who had made a profession of spending their lives out on the water and probably had experienced some of these kinds of storms, but were perhaps close enough to the shore that they could reasonably get away from the storm before great damage was caused, and they weren't worried about being out in the middle and their boat capsizing or breaking up and sinking. But they too are terrified and waking Jesus and don't have any clue what he's going to do, because they've never seen him interface with the elements like this. And yet they're pleading to him because this is the last-ditch effort before their greatest fear becomes their reality, and they all die. Jesus, wake up. We are about to die. Don't you care? But what we need to understand is that this is something of a theme that these gospel writers are all introducing for us into their narrative here. And this is a stroke of literary genius when you think about it, because they're taking this theme from the Old Testament in many different places, where this concept of water oftentimes being looked at as something of a chaotic thing, especially large bodies of water, seas and oceans, and how they bring disorder, disharmony, and chaos into existence. And yet God is interfacing with that water, and he is breaking all of that apart, and he's bringing order, he's bringing harmony to the troubled water, and he's rescuing a person, or he's rescuing a group. Israel's greatest story was that of the Exodus. To the Christian faith, what the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus is, the Exodus would be to the Jewish community centuries, millennia before Jesus showed up. And it is one of the oldest celebrated religious feasts that's still being observed today by large communities of Jews across the world. And that is the Passover, which marks the beginning of the Exodus from Egypt, right? And so what we see is, after the 10 plagues and they're finally expelled from Egypt and they're making their way across the Sinai Peninsula up into where the Red Sea is, and they wind their way through that tiny little wadi, that dry riverbed, until they get to the Nueva beachhead, and there they are, cut off by the water, but they're led to the place where God intended them for them to go, because Moses is at the head of the camp. And then, whereas they may have thought of that as a moment of respite, to rest, to let their animals kind of relax a little bit, ease some of the burdens on their back, taking down the cargo from them and whatnot, then what do they see up on the embankment? But here comes Pharaoh and his armies, and he's giving them the command to charge. And it looks like they have nothing but murderous rage in their eyes. And then God cuts off the Israelite camp by bringing down that pillar of cloud and making it so thick and impenetrable, the Egyptian ranks can't go through it. On into the night, and it becomes a pillar of fire. And God is blasting, as the poets in Psalms would say, with the breath of his nostrils, rebuffing the sea, pushing it back, so that in the morning, when the sun begins to peek over that eastern horizon, and the Israelites are looking beyond Moses into what was the Red Sea, now they see these two massive walls that have created a chasm for them to walk through on dry ground to escape the Egyptians, right? And of course, God is their rescuer. They called out to him for help, And God answered by parting the waters and drowning the armies of Pharaoh that they would never see again. And after that event in Exodus, reaching forward into the future, as more narrative would develop and other poetic writings in different genres would come into play as part of the scriptural body of literature, if a prophet or a biblical writer wanted to speak about the greatness of God, probably would wind up referring back to this event. Case in point, Isaiah 43, verses 14 through 17. I just want to read this for you to kind of get a feel for what we're talking about. This is what the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One, says. Because of you, I will send an army to Babylon and bring all of them as fugitives, even the Chaldeans and the ships in which they rejoice. I am the Lord, your Holy One, the Creator of Israel, your King. This is what the Lord says, who makes a way in the sea, a path through raging water, who brings out the chariot and horse, the army and the mighty one together. They lie down, but they do not rise again. They are extinguished, put out like a wick. He's calling back to that poetic imagery and that through poetic imagery to that moment in which he had proven himself faithful and rescued them from their captors that were literally pressing upon them in that moment and would have taken their lives from them had God not intervened. And he made a way through the impossible body of water to cross, and he rescued them, and he will do this again from the Babylonians, right? Poetically, the symbol of a large body of water, such as the sea, is usually used to illustrate trouble, disorder, chaos, as we've said before. And one place we can go back to would be at the beginning of the book, Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and water was upon the face of the deep, right? Or the Spirit hovered above the water that was upon the face of the deep. And so that water is representing the dark, tumultuous chaos from which God first brought order by commanding there be light, and eventually brings further order by drawing dry land up from this chaotic ocean, and then groups all the waters into one place to say he has brought ultimate solidarity and order to the raging body of water and the chaos that was the primordial earth before God acted upon it. And we can see this concept applied to an individual who feels like they are being troubled. The psalm writer in Psalm 69, verses 1 through 2 says, "Save me, God, for the water has risen to my neck. I have sunk deep in the mud, and there is no footing. I have come into deep water, and a flood sweeps over me." And so they're not talking literally about being out in the muck and mire of mud and sinking as if it were quicksand and they can't find their way out of it, or being out in a body of water and they're about to drown, but they're poetically and metaphorically comparing their troubles that are overcoming them as if they were in those scenarios, right? So the trouble, the disorder, the chaos that they're experiencing. And then this is also applied corporately through the examples we've seen, but another one would be Psalm 106, verses 8 and 9. "Yet he, God, saved them for his name's sake, to make his power known. He rebuked the Red Sea." Rebuke that. Understand that. He took charge. He commanded the ocean or the sea, and it parted, and it dried up, and he led them through the depths as through a desert. So we see that in Israel's past, when they think of the idea of water and trouble and chaos, the idea is that God is their rescuer and that he is the one who redeems and brings them through that chaos and disorder. And when Jesus is out there with them on the water and they wake him up, and the first thing he does is he stands at the bow of the ship and he speaks to the ocean and tells it to be calm, and immediately the waves obey and everything is peaceful. And in one gospel account it says, presuming they're somewhere around the middle of the Sea of Galilee, they are instantaneously transported to the nearest shore where they're going to disembark and now meet the demoniacs from Gerasenes or Gadara. And before that episode happens, he looks at them and he asks, what happened to your faith? I said we were going across, right? But it prompts the question that Matthew so skillfully puts forth in Matthew 8:27 when he says the disciples who are now gripped with fear, utterly terrified, and they ask, what kind of man is this? Because while it is indeed miraculous and beyond comprehension except for to see it with the eyes, and still it boggles the mind how God can work through a human being to dispel demonic influence and presence from a person. or to heal a person who is sick and lame or blind even. And Jesus hasn't even done some of those miracles yet as far as bringing people back from the dead. But he has indeed demonstrated hefty amount of divine power in healing people from their sicknesses and ailments. And we really don't know what the nature of many of those were, because they're just simply summed up in very generic statements of those who were lame, with what kind of lamenity or so forth, right? But nonetheless, they have stories of prophets doing these kinds of miracles in the past, very bizarre things even, like Elisha making the axe head float in the water, or even a deadly concoction of gourds and vegetables that was mixed into a soup that was killing the people who were eating it, and then he throws in some flour and now it's edible, right? And just very weird things like that, if we're being honest. And then, it's again, not too much of a stretch to see that God is working miraculously again through a prophet that he has sent to his people. But never, ever, ever was it ever mentioned that any prophet would ever be expected to have this kind of power. It wasn't expected Messiah would have this kind of power, at least not at a surface glance of many of the passages in the Old Testament that speak about him. They know that the God who created the cosmos commands the winds and the waves, and they obey him. But to think that that presence is now standing embodied before them, mind equals blown. It doesn't even begin to touch that. This is one of those Isaiah 6 moments where Isaiah in the temple, seeing the glory of God and overcome with all manner of just tremulousness at the idea that he's standing in the presence of God and realizes just how indeed sinful he is. And a moment like Peter had that precludes this episode, when he knelt down before Jesus and begged him to leave him because he knows that Jesus is a holy man and that he is indeed evil and doesn't deserve to be in his presence. But this is a whole different persona. This is a whole different perspective, that indeed the very God of the cosmos, the God of Israel, the one who covenanted with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who led them out of Egypt and through the wilderness for those 40 years, brought them into this land, has been faithful to them generation after generation, who commands angel armies, is standing before them in the person of Jesus, the Nazarene carpenter. They're terrified. Terrified. Rightly so. And then we jump into the beginning of chapter 5, which is the focus of the story here. Just another perspective on it from Mark's standpoint, where we have this man who confronts Jesus as soon as Jesus and his disciples disembark the boat, and immediately the demons cry out to him, "Jesus, Son of God, what do you have to do with us?" And if you think about it, in the other gospel narratives that give us more background of Jesus' past before the beginning of his ministry, we have in Matthew's gospel the proclamation by Gabriel to Mary that when the Holy Spirit overshadows her and she conceives, the child in her womb will indeed be the Son of God. An angel speaks these words. And then we have the presentation of Jesus after he is baptized by John in the Jordan, and the Father speaks and attests to the fact that this is indeed his Son. So spiritual entities have been the ones to proclaim this, but no human voice at any point in any gospel narrative has proclaimed this. And now a demon, yet again another spiritual entity, but working through the vocal cords of a human being, is crying out that Jesus is the Son of God. And whereas the disciples were not part of either of those other episodes, probably not alive when Jesus was conceived, wouldn't have mattered if they were anyway, far too young to have remembered, were not present at the seaside or the riverside when Jesus was baptized, and if they were, may not have heard that voice. And there would only be one or two candidates that would fit that category anyway. So none of them are thinking this, that while he's Messiah, that he's not God embodied in human flesh. And now they are coming to this realization after what they just experienced. Matthew doesn't give us the answer to that, nor does Mark, nor does Luke, when this question is asked by each of those of the disciples, albeit slightly worded differently in each of those accounts. But what kind of man is this? Matthew doesn't insert parenthetically like John does at times what's going on here or what he wants us to understand by this. He doesn't say that God has now become incarnated in human flesh. What kind of man is this? Let's answer this question. Well, he's the one that drives out hordes of demons from one or two people at one time who are confessing that he is indeed the Son of God, God incarnated in human flesh. And they're terrified even more, but they're not the only ones, and we're not really focusing on them so much now. Now this dread and dread and fear of Jesus spreads to the townspeople, who after some time will pass, several minutes, maybe even as much as an hour, when word will have to spread throughout the nearest villages, And this man has time to finally get new clothes, probably provided by Jesus' disciples, and now sit at Jesus' feet and listen to him do some teaching in preparation for the fact he's going to be sent back to these people and live among them and testify of the glory and miraculous work of God amongst them as Jesus refuses his offer to accompany him on his journeys, right? And then finally, as the townspeople are spreading this like crazy, and a big ruckus is started by these people coming out to see what's going on and seeing this man clothed and now obviously in his right mind, and having heard that the pigs just ran off the cliff and there's not a single trace of them anywhere to be found. That's money obviously lost, and all other sorts of resources that perhaps would come from those pigs. And maybe while these people were probably influenced by Greco-Roman religion and the idea that the gods indeed interface with humanity at any time that they want to, and whereas in other places like in the book of Acts where Paul and Silas on their journeys are even greeted as gods, Paul as Hermes, the messenger of Zeus, and Silas because he's not the one talking so much as Zeus, and because they heal a man, these people want to bring out a calf and slaughter it and crown them with wreaths and flowers and bring out precious linen garments for him and all these other things. These people are not acting as if the gods have visited them. They are terrified, and they don't know what is meant by this. Obviously, this must be a sign of wrath, that they would send all of their herd, 2,000 pigs, as Mark says, hurling over the cliff. And if you can imagine Jesus' finger probably pointing to the pigs, and they don't hear anything. They may have not even, at least those who are part of the herdsman group watching over these, may not have even heard the words that Jesus spoke, or this man, or the demons through this man spoke to Jesus. All they see is what's going on here, and now it's like, what just happened? And these people are terrified. In these two encounters, Jesus literally becomes the subject of fear and trepidation. Why? Why wouldn't these people be glad that their problem has finally been solved, right? I mean, if this man has been cured, if he's been cleansed of this demonic presence, then what is there to be frightened about? Everything to be thankful for, because now they can perhaps travel safely through those towns and villages without worrying about this man jumping out from behind rocks and maybe even trying to overtake them and do violent things to them and all that stuff. Instead of thanking Jesus and maybe even offering him some degree of compensation as if this was an act of public service, they want him gone. They want him gone. And this is what I would simply focus on with a little bit of time that we have remaining here, and that is simply the meaning behind why this story is present. Yes, there are different levels to this, and part of the sub-meaning would be that Jesus does indeed restore those who have been oppressed by demonic presence and even demonic entities that may have possessed their bodies. And there's all manner of anecdotal stories from third world countries and even here in the United States of people being delivered from demon oppression and possession. But that's not the focus here. And the focus indeed is to show that Jesus has authority over spiritual entities, but we've already seen that in all of these other Gospels before we get to this point. So it's not to raise the question of whether or not he does command demons and they will obey. It's the fact that it's the fear factor and the shock value that comes from these stories that readers of these Gospels, whether believers or not, are meant to understand. And that is that Jesus is indeed the embodied Godhead, or the fullness thereof. And he is terrifying. I mean, Revelation is the only book that we have a pronouncement of blessing for anyone who reads those words of the prophecy out loud. And indeed, a blessing is garnered from doing so, right? But at the beginning of that book, when we see John interfacing with Jesus, he's not seeing the Nazarene carpenter in his resurrected form that left him all those decades before. Now he is seeing the very presence and entity that Ezekiel did, high and lifted up above this portable throne that's being carted around by cherubim in the opening chapter of his book, and that divine creature who is standing straddling the riverbanks later on in his gospel, and talking about how dazzling white this person is, and this golden sash that surrounds him, and his feet like burnished bronze. He's not talking about an angel. He's talking about Jesus. Because it's the exact same imagery that John is giving us in the beginning chapter of the book of Revelation. And we are seeing the apocalypsos, the unveiling of Jesus' glory. And I'm sure that really struck a tone with John, considering what he saw and remembered from standing there with Peter and his brother James that day on the top of the mountain, when all of a sudden Jesus' countenance and his figure began to change, and he was transfigured in front of them. And this massive cloud that came out of nowhere is now surrounding them, and it's palpable, it's thick, it's bright, and a booming voice comes out of nowhere after Peter says, because Elijah and Moses showed up, they should build little tabernacles for all of them so they could just stay up there. And the Father says, "No, this is my Son, you will listen to him." His presence is terrifying. Terrifying. And if there's one thing that we should consider taking away from this, friend, it's that, well, Jesus is our shepherd. Jesus is our friend. He is our master. He loves us beyond human comprehension with respect to love. Yet we will stand before the one in whom all authority is invested in to judge both the living and the dead. And we will have to give an accounting for how we used our time here and the resources that he gave us. And while our sin will not be called into question because that was placed on him, and his righteousness has been imputed unto us, and we have no reason or means of fearing whether or not we will be condemned before God. We won't be. But friend, we will be scrutinized for what we did. Jesus makes this incredibly clear from both the Gospels, through the writing of the apostles in their epistles, and in the final act of Revelation itself. We will be judged. And that should give us great reason to pause and to consider our manner of living and what we are doing to advance the kingdom, to enter into the kingdom, to proclaim the kingdom, to seek the kingdom and God's righteousness, to not simply placate God by reading the scriptures and thereby coming across these little moments of reading things like that from the Sermon on the Mount or other places where Jesus gives us commands of things we're supposed to be doing, and focus a little bit more on trying to be more morally upright or whatever the case might be. But we are to be like that one who found the pearl of great price, and he sold everything he had to possess that pearl, which symbolizes the kingdom. And then the one who found this treasure buried in a field and sold all he had to possess the field, so that no one else could have that treasure, that we are to give our all for the kingdom. And friend, I don't have to sit here and tell you how to do all those things, nor is it my place, certainly not in this lesson, but to encourage you to dig deep in Scripture, because the compulsion should be within you as if it's an insatiable thirst, an unquenchable appetite, in which you cannot help but think of hardly anything else other than, how do I please my Savior? What is it he wants me to do? He has put me here for a reason, and it's not to have simple, polite conversations with people over things like politics and weather and sports and the things that kind of characterize genteel Southern life, but to really get into people's lives and talk about the gospel, because our time here is so limited and so precious. And for those of us who have committed ourselves to the things of this world, in that it's not an unholy thing, it's not a bad thing, marriage is beautiful, but because we've anchored ourselves to families, we have commitments, even on into our senior years as grandparents and so forth, to have to care for families and mentor those that God has given us to raise and to help encourage over the course of our lives and theirs. But friend, we have an obligation to our neighbor around us. As Jesus said in Luke 10, who was the neighbor to the one who was beaten and left nearly dead? The Samaritan. Then go and do like him. Go and do like him. Because if we don't, what will our excuse be when we stand before him? What will we say? And it certainly should not sit well with us that we can admit now that we might hang our head in shame because we haven't done enough. And we're not doing enough to get into the kingdom. We're doing enough for him to say, enter in, because you have been a good and faithful servant, and I have prepared your reward for you. Not enter in, and I wish I had more for you, but considering what you failed to do. So I'm not trying to make us feel like garbage. Forgive me if that's what's happened, friend. If it has, perhaps there is because there's a hint of conviction here, as there is with me, as I'm not settled in any day that I finish out here on this earth thinking that I've done enough. So what if I shared the gospel with somebody today? Tomorrow's a new day. You cannot live nor thrive on yesterday's victories. So what if I went on a mission trip this year? What about these people who I work with and the people in my family who I know are hellbound if they do not come to saving faith in Jesus? That doesn't mean that I have to berate them with the gospel every time I see them, but am I pouring over them in prayer? Am I seeking opportunities to readdress the gospel with them? Am I trying to find new ways in which I can present Jesus to them? Not just simply haggardly giving up. And not shaking my head and thinking because of the things I see in the newspapers or hear being preached to me through the news waves every day on social media sites, that this world is just doomed. Because that's not the case, friend. It's not the case. Jesus is still saving souls every single day. And just because we don't hear about it doesn't mean that it's not happening. So friend, I encourage you, please, spend some time today and throughout this week, as I hope to myself and will, reflect more on what this means, understanding that while I enjoy every moment I spend with Jesus in prayer and at his feet, in his word, listening to him teach, that he indeed has something of a terrifying presence. His holiness reveals that every day. And that's part of the reason, perhaps sometimes, why we feel a little bit shameful when we come before him. We know we've sinned and messed up, right? Be that as it may, let's confess what needs to be confessed. Let's come clean before him and before the congregation of believers. And let's seek to be walking before him in righteousness and in purity of heart and being guided by and sensitive to the voice of the Holy Spirit, and our heads constantly on the move, looking for opportunities to be the body of Jesus, his voice, his hands, his feet to this world, friends. And as Jesus sent this man back to his own and said, "You go proclaim the kingdom and the works of God to them," so he has sent us, friends. Take that and let that be your motivation throughout the course of this week. He has sent you, having cleansed you, clothed you with his Spirit, put you in your right mind, and brought you into a new relationship with God, having reconciled you, adopted you as a son and daughter, filled you with his presence, and given you all the resources that you need with all spiritual blessings in high places to serve him faithfully. Father, may you be glorified through what has been said today. We love you, we thank you, and we pray for what comes next through the preaching hour. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you for listening.